Chapter 5 Embers. Smoke rose lazily from the charred remains of what had once been the Goblin's Head Tavern. It drifted skyward, mingling with the smoke from the hundreds of other burnt-out husks that Grog had passed on his miserable walk through the broken town of Longdale. Grog's impulse to drown his sorrows in ale was so overwhelming that he momentarily considered trying to force his way through the blackened beams and rubble to reach the cellar. As he shuffled forward, however, it became clear that there was still far too much heat radiating from the piles of glowing ash for him to attempt that shameful task. At least, for now. So he stood on the road, staring balefully at the debris, not caring when smoke wafted into his eyes and filled them with stinging tears. The Goblin's Head had been Grog's second home for more than a year. It had been his refuge and his escape from the torment of his own mind. Now it was gone, taken from him by the same bastard evil dwarves who'd caused the torment in the first place. The same bastard evil dwarves who'd taken everything from him. "I need a drink," Grog said to the cinders of the dead pub. Then he turned and continued on towards his home. Between all the dregs and all the bottles scattered around his little shack, surely there'd be enough ale to take the edge off. Maybe he even had a couple of unopened bottles left. A dwarf could hope. As Grog trudged through the eerily quiet streets, he felt the throbbing in his skull gaining strength, and a sting returning to his injured right buttock. The Nissen weed was beginning to wear off. He quickened his pace. A surge of relief flooded through Grog as he approached the narrow dirt path that led from the edge of town to his shack, and saw the top of his chimney. There'd been a very real possibility that his house, like so many others, had been burned to the ground. But apparently, the invading dwarfs hadn't made it this far, or simply hadn't bothered to put the torch to such a squalid hovel. As Grog made his way along the path, however, and drew closer to his little home, the feeling of relief was swiftly replaced with a blend of anger, confusion, and trepidation. A large ram with a fine leather saddle was tied by a rope to Grog's fence, and an exceptionally strange-looking dwarf, who Grog assumed was the beast's rider, was standing in Grog's front garden. Grog approached cautiously, unable to decide what he found most bizarre about his unwelcome guest. The dwarf's face was covered in white full-moon war paint, and he had an angry scar over his left eye. He was clearly a warrior of great renown, but instead of armor and a helm, he wore a simple brown woolen shirt and a floppy burgundy cap. He would have looked almost comical, were it not for the horrific weapons strapped to his back. Grog had spent nearly 40 years in the army. He'd been stabbed, whacked, sliced, and clobbered with pretty much every weapon imaginable. But he'd never seen anything like the grotesque clubs this dwarf carried. They were fashioned almost entirely from the bones of male mountain goats. The head of each club was a blood-spattered skull, complete with protruding teeth, gaping eye sockets, and a pair of rock-hard horns. The whole mess was held together with strips of leather and iron clamps. They were horrible. Grog really wanted one. To top off this peculiar scene, Grog's visitor had an extremely large rock in his hands, which he was repeatedly lifting over his head with raucous grunts of exertion. The strange dwarf watched Grog as he approached, but gave no indication that he was going to stop his exercise session until Grog had almost reached the place where his front gate had once been. At that point, the white-faced dwarf hurled the rock to the side, where it crushed a small patch of weeds and the remains of what might have once been a wooden bucket. The dwarf said, rolling his shoulders, "Oh, I'm terribly sorry," Grog said, splaying a dramatic hand across his chest. "So rude of me to keep you waiting. It's just that I didn't know there was going to be a scar-faced, goat-club-wielding lunatic lifting rocks in my front garden. If I'd known, I'd have rushed home sooner." The dwarf grinned. "You always were a funny bastard, General." The word general sent a shiver running across Grog's shoulders. He took a few steps closer to the strange dwarf. "You know me?" The dwarf's smile widened. "Course I know ye." Grog leaned forward and squinted, taking in every detail of his visitor's face, from the scarred, milky left eye to the strands of grey in his dark, wiry beard. "Well, I'm sorry, chum," he said eventually, throwing up his hands, "but I dinna know you." The dwarf chuckled. "I've changed a little. The last time you saw me, I didn't have this." He pointed at his scar. "Or this." He gestured at his white face. "Or these." He reached back and patted the ram's skull. "The last time you saw me, we'd just finished dealing with a pretty insane Afank invasion in Realm 7. Images of fighting demonic haunted water creatures flitted across Grog's memory. "After we'd driven them off," the dwarf continued, "we all got drunk, and some dwarves decided to swim naked across the Oglin River. Do you remember?" Grog nodded. "I remember it was unbelievably foolish. A couple of dwarves nearly drowned." "Including me," the dwarf laughed, as though the memory of his near-death experience was particularly hilarious. "But it was you that challenged the troops to do it." "Maybe," said Grog, who was too busy staring intently at the dwarf's face to argue. "Wait!" The dwarf raised his white painted eyebrows expectantly. "Leatherbasher!" Grog said, pointing a triumphant finger right at the delighted dwarf's nose. "Sergeant Theetham Leatherbasher!" "That's me, sir, although I'm no longer a sergeant." Theetham puffed out his chest. "I'm now a full moon, as you can see, and personal bodyguard to King Gelgrim Brewblade of the Second Realm." "Oh, shit." Grog's shoulders slumped. "That's why you're here? To try and get me to go and talk with the bloody king?" "No, sir, not try. I will be taking you back with me." There was no threat or anger in Theetham's voice. He spoke as though merely stating a fact. Grog analysed Theetham's smiling face, weighed up his options, and chose beer. "All right, fine, I'll go with you. Just let me get a few things first, okay?" He inclined his bandaged head towards his house. Theetham gave Grog a suspicious look, but moved out of his way. As soon as he was inside, Grog started inspecting the bottles strewn around his house. "These things you've got to get," Theetham said, leaning casually against the doorframe and watching Grog's increasingly frantic search. "You keep them in ale bottles, do you?" Grog didn't answer. None of the bottles on the tables or benches had yielded more than a mouthful, and a search of his few cupboards was proving completely fruitless. After a while, Theetham cleared his throat. "General, I didn't know if you're aware, but the latest reports seem to indicate that the whole of the 13 realms is under attack. With all due respect, we need to go now. The king is waiting." "Theetham," Grog said, ripping items of ragged clothing out of a dusty chest and throwing them over his shoulder. I'm not a general anymore. And with all due respect, the king can go fuck himself. I'm not going anywhere. A loud thud from behind Grog caused him to pause his desperate search and turn around. Thetham had unslung one of the billy clubs from the holster at his back and allowed its blood-stained head to fall to the floor. He was no longer smiling. Grog, you were the best leader I ever served under, Thetham said. I've got a lot of respect for you, and ancient ones know what a hard time you must have had since the Battle of Algan's Pass. But if you dinna come with me now, I'm going to have to knock you out and sling you over the back of my mount like a sack of potatoes. Grog considered getting angry, but found that he just didn't have it in him. The Nisan weed had made him drowsy, but was now barely taking the edge off his terrible headache. He was also seriously nauseous, and his hands were shaking like branches in a storm. You'd really clobber me with that thing? Grog said, sitting down on the floor and pointing an unsteady finger at Thetham's extraordinary weapons. Can't you see I've just had my head split open? I really don't want to, Thetham said, but my vows to the king are unbreakable. If I'm commanded to bring you to him, he shrugged, I have to bring you to him. But what for? Grog protested. I'm fat, old, tired and useless. I've got a cut across my arse cheeks as long as a donkey's dick, and my head feels like it's about to cave in. What can I do? It's not up to me to make that... Look! Grog interrupted, holding out his badly quivering hands for Thetham to see. What can I do? Well, both the king and Broughton Gruntlog seem to think... Broughton! Grog cut across Thetham again. I swear, that bastard saved my life just to torment me. Why, in the endless pit of darkness, do they think I can help anyone? Look at the state of me. Thetham did look. He considered Grog for a long moment. Then he rested his club against the wall. Wait there, he said. Then he turned and walked out of the house. Grog was up on his feet and tiptoeing towards Thetham's weapon in an instant. He heard the deep bleating of the ram outside as he wrapped his trembling hands around the bone handle. By the time Thetham appeared back at the doorway, Grog had retreated into his shack and was standing with his feet set. Thetham's white face broke into a bemused smile. Really? I'm not going. But I just went and grabbed this for you. Thetham held up a metal flask. I'll trade it for that. He pointed at the club with his other hand. Grog licked his lips. What is it? This. Thetham gave the flask a little shake. Is smolder whiskey, tapped from the king's personal toasted oak barrels. Deal. Grog marched across the room without a moment's hesitation and offered the club to Thetham. Thetham took it and handed over the flask. Grog unscrewed the lid and took an investigative sniff. No trick had been played. The vapors that rose from the flask were so strong that Grog felt like several of his nose hairs had been singed off. He raised the flask to his lips and scowled. After a few searing gulps, he lowered his head, closed his eyes, and, as the burning liquid poured into his stomach, he let out a shuddering sigh, which was part relief and part pain. When he opened his eyes again, he was overwhelmed by a wave of shame. Thanks, he muttered, staring down at the floor. Then he raised the flask and drank again. I think this'll be good for you, Thetham said, once Grog had sucked the last few drops from the flask and was screwing the lid back on. Grog nodded and gave a grunt of affirmation. He wasn't ready to speak yet. His mouth and throat were too busy being on fire. I don't mean the whiskey. Theetham reached out and took the empty flask from Grog. I mean this. Coming with me, saving the kingdom, getting away from... He trailed off and gestured vaguely around Grog's ramshackle hovel. It'll be good to be doing something worthwhile. I do worthwhile things. Grog slurred, struggling to make his numb tongue move as intended. Like what? Like I go to that pub, which is burned down, but I also do things around the house, and just loads of stuff. You make a strong point, Theetham said gravely. I can see why your choice between staying here or coming with me to help serve your kingdom in a time of desperate need is a difficult one. I'm too sick, Grog said. I'm too tired and sore. I'm too badly injured. I'm not a warrior anymore, Theetham. I'm certainly not a general. I don't think they want you to be, Theetham said. I'm not even sure they want you to fight. The king and Broughton were talking about you being one of the only dwarves who knows how to find the faithbound. I think they want you to guide a group into the mountains. Oh, is that all? Grog actually staggered backwards at the absurdness of Theetham's statement. Possibly because the smolder whiskey was hitting him like a heated iron sledgehammer. Well, why didn't you say? If all they want me to do is lead a group to the absolute peaks of the most treacherous, beast-infested, freezing fucking awful mountains on the face of Iridas, well, that's no problem. I'm sensing a little sarcasm, Grog. Sarcasm? Oh, ancient ones forbid. No. This is enthusiasm. I love visiting the faithbound. They're a wonderful bunch of dwarves, and not at all the cult of fanatical, humorless, psycho nutters that everyone makes them out to be. Well, I'm glad you're so excited. Let's get moving. Grog jabbed a single thick finger out towards Theetham. Give me one good reason why I should. I'll give you two, Theetham said. The first is that back at the Burgomaster's manor, where the king is staying, there's a vast quantity of fine whiskey and also some very potent Nissen weed. Theetham held up his gruesome hammer and pointed to its head. The second is that... Forget the second reason! Grog waved Theetham's imminent threat off like he was swatting at a fly. Stop wasting time with your chatter, let's go! Theetham grinned as Grog lurched unsteadily towards his front door. But his grin fell away as Grog suddenly stopped and frowned, his eyes narrowing in deep and serious thought. Oh, come on, Grog, no more bullshit. 1 second. Grog retreated back to his clothes chest and began flinging clothes over his shoulder again. You don't need to dig around for some secret stash of flat old ale, Grog, Theetham yelled. We've got that covered, okay? Grog grabbed a final tattered shirt from the bottom of the chest and surrendered a loud sigh as he gazed at what lay beneath it. Remember this, Theetham? He asked, as he reverently lifted his most prized possession out of the chest. I sold my axe, my shield, my helm, even my boots. But this... He held up a blackened steel chainmail shirt. This was crafted by the finest armorsmiths in all the 13 realms, and given to me by High King Owen himself. They saved my life so many times. I just couldn't part with it. blade blunter, Thetham said, with a touch of awe in his voice. That's what it's called, isn't it? Aye, lad, that's what it's called. Grog nodded somberly as he ran his eyes over the perfect interlocking rings. Now, he looked around his house and instantly decided that there wasn't a single other thing worth taking. Let's get out of this shithole and go see the king, shall we?